These three figures, well, one you'll recognize, that's Deleuze. This is Alain Badiou, slightly looking. I like to have Deleuze and Badiou's two pictures alongside each other, so Badiou is looking lovingly at Deleuze. Deleuze is not reciprocating, I think. And this is a chap called Michel Henry. And what's interesting about them all is that they're all philosophers of immanence. They believe that the best way to understand reality is through one principle alone, of which there is, if you like, everything is exhaustively understood, and without any transcendental, no God, no transcendental being, no transcendental language with capital L. Everything must be understood immanently. But the problem is they all have completely different notion of what is immanence. Something naturalistic for Deleuze, something got to do with mathematics, and believe it or not, something got to do with divine auto-affection for Henry. What I find interesting is that these two characters, Badiou and Henry, as I'll explain in my diagrammatic way eventually, I think they come out of Deleuze. They come out of a certain tensions and elements in Deleuze that these two figures, Badiou and Henry, bring to a limit, bring to an extreme, push to almost an absurd limit. So we're here to remap to Deleuze. So I'd like to ask, really, what is it to map a philosophy or to map a theory in any case? Is it the same thing as to sketch a theory or to outline a theory? Such spatializations or minimalizations can be read in other ways, as condensations. I'm going to condense the theory down. That's something Bergson talks about. Or as subtractions. I'm going to subtract the best elements. Badiou talks about that. For Deleuze, the key word is diagram. A diagrammatic depiction of a theory is one that modulates, as he puts it, a theory. That is to say, it abstracts a theory. A philosophy has its own abstract machine, its own, as he puts it, diagrammatic machine, that dynamically outlines the functions or processes, the relations or differences within and between theories. So that's what I'm going to talk about today, abstractions and diagrams. So first of all, here is the abstract of this paper for you to read again. So there's the abstract of my paper. Now using slightly this term, it's a set of words at the moment, but I'm using the word abstract almost in a technical sense. So there's the abstract. This paper is on Deleuze's Diagrammatic Actualism and discusses the two versions of Deleuze that struggle for preeminence within Deleuzianism. One is that of the virtual and the concept or idea. The other is of the actual and the diagram, as I'll be arguing. Naturally, when it comes to Deleuze, such tendencies are always intertwined. Anyway, please yourself. But we still need to establish whether the virtual and the concept deserve the ontological priority that they have hitherto received within Deleuzian scholarship. We've heard a lot of the virtual today. And people often say, and of course the actual is very important too, and it kind of feeds back on the virtual. But I'm an actualist, as you'll learn, and I'm all for the actual. I don't like the virtue. Perhaps the actual can be derived from its currently derivative status when its ontology is understood diagrammatically. This paper is blah, blah, blah. First attempt at such a review. That's just an apology for it being a little bit rough at the edges. So, that's the abstract. So far, so wordy, you might say. As diagrams go, there's not much in there. So here are a few more words on diagrams. Leibniz once wrote that drawing was a very useful tool against the uncertainty of words. More recently, Michel Ledoux has discussed the crucial influence of philosophical imagery in guiding philosophical argument. Leibniz's is a realist stance, Ledoux is at least sceptical, if not an out-and-out relativist one. Even the best and most zealous of those who employ visual images as metaphors, W.J.T. Mitchell in literary studies, James Bunn in aesthetics, Randall Dipert in ontology, and Bergson in philosophy, he's most famous for his visual images and diagrams, all caution us in their use, but all the same, the temptation remains amongst phenomenologists, Bergsonians, and Deleuzians alike to employ them liberally. We talk of the arrow of intentionality, if we're Husserlians. We talk of chiasmic reversibility, if we read Merleau-Ponty, or the cone of the pure past, if we follow Deleuze/Bergson. Are these graphic images simply helping us to understand, or do they stand in a more literal relationship with the concepts to which they are bound, as ends rather than just as means? And why not as ends? I think it's time we gave images, and diagrams in particular, their due. So where, one might ask, is the diagram of my own talk, given my confidence in such things? Now, usually at this stage of a paper, the speaker might present an outline of his or her talk thus. Here's an outline of my paper. Abstract, now outline, not just a diagram. And those are the various sections I'll be going through. I won't bore you with them, but I will go through them eventually. We have 11 points here. Perhaps to be consistent, I should relate the numbered points spatially, positioning them and connecting them with lines, arrows, blocks of colour, erected bars, tall or short, slices of pie chart, mean or generous, and so on. And in fact, at this stage, PowerPoint, which I'm using, does offer one a choice, which I thought I'd introduce to you now as possibly the world's first ever meta PowerPoint slide. This is what at one point it can. PowerPoint offers this facility. It's amazing. It's quite interesting to look at. The first one on the left is an organization chart used to show hierarchical relationships. Next one beside it is used to show top, middle, top row. Used to show a process with a continuous cycle. I love the next one on the top right. Used to show relationships of a core element. The core is going to be the virtual. And so on. Bottom left, used to show foundation-based relationships. Descartes would be very popular there. Next one, used to show areas of overlap between elements. And then finally, used to show steps towards a goal. So the middle circle, the inner ring, that's my goal, which is to convince you of my point, and so on and so on. This is all done spatially. And I think there's a lot of intuitive grasp that PowerPoint designers, think about how the mind works. I think, it's as good as any way of summarizing what diagrams are like. But these are hardly helpful when compared to Deleuze's diagrams, because, as we will see, they are far too static. Take a look at a sample of Deleuze's dynamic images, which, he argues, are neither iconic nor symbolic, neither resembling nor representing anything, but rather in their movement instantiating that which they supposedly look like or symbolize. So those are some of Deleuze's diagrams, slightly different from Bill Gates' idea of what a diagram should look like, especially top left. You'll recognize these are all from Fold. My argument is basically that, whereas Deleuze tends to think of his diagrams as virtual processes, as only a potentially concrete or actual thing, I believe that it is better to think of them as already actual processes. So that's the argument. And I'll try to convince you of this point, my goal, my inner circle, again, by looking at the two ways in which one can read Deleuze, virtually or actually. I do this via the comparable philosophies of Alain Badiou and Michel Henry, and their extremely different theories of abstraction. Ones that take the idea, in Badiou, and the affectivity, Henry, out of Deleuze and push them to their limits. My point will be that the diagram embodies both actual affect and idea without being virtual. And so here's my point, which I'm now going to point at. The point. That is my diagram, which you will not understand. That's fine. But in a sense, the point of the whole talk is to start looking at diagrams as drawings. Not in terms of what they represent, but as things, as objects. And you'll see a relationship. I'm going to explain where that diagram comes from in terms of a certain genealogy of other diagrams in Deleuze, in Bergson, in Badiou, and so on and so on. A whole set of diagrams, a way of reading philosophy through the diagrams philosophers use, if you like, to spatialize their thought. Instead of the words, I will obviously be giving you lots of words, I'm afraid. And you can tune out for some of those words. When I'm talking about Badiou and Henry, it gets a bit dry. But every now and then there'll be these diagrams, and that's really the point. If I could do the paper over again, eventually it would be all diagrams. And indeed, the diagrams would be moving. They'd be morphing into each other in a kind of video shorts. And that's kind of where I'm trying to go to eventually. And it would be far more practical piece of work. But at the moment, that's all I can do with PowerPoint and slides and stuff like that, so it looks like this. So you've got Henry and Badiou. It's two extremes, top, left and right, coming out of the Deleuzian virtual, and so on. What the numbers mean, you needn't worry about that either. their relationship, Badiou is interested in the matheme, as we'll see, Henry as the patheme. But what's interesting, or I think interesting, is that each point, wherever there is a word, in traditional old-fashioned philosophy, wherever the word matheme or Badiou comes up, in theory you could put another diagram. You could reiterate the diagram again and again, another kind of diagrammatic philosophy. In a sense, diagrammatic philosophy is failing when you have to start putting in words to say what the images are about. It would be better to put in another diagram there to zoom in and so on and so on. Okay. So as you can see, it's a fairly large point. Badiou and Henry, I'm saying, come out of Deleuze, big broad gesture, they come out of Deleuze and push him to extreme limits out there. Though later there'll be a way of bringing those extremes back again. They come back in if you follow the arrows and so on. So as I said, I'm looking at diagrams as objects and relating them to each other as moving objects. Okay. Now I'm afraid it's time for some words. The two Deleuzes, naturalism and idealism. A quote from James Williams, my colleague, on Gilles Deleuze. Quote, Deleuze can be interpreted, either sympathetically or not, as depending on a strong materialism that brings him close to positions in contemporary science, thereby devaluing his work on ideas, indifference, repetition. Or he can be interpreted as overemphasizing a new ideal and virtual field at the expense of the actual, thereby leading to accusations of an anti-Platonism that merely replicates its biggest fault instead of inverting or correcting it. So, actualist or virtualist, naturalist or idealist, albeit of a special sort. This is the perpetual duplicity in Deleuze, which has proven to be a real problem for its interpreters. Here's how Brian Masumi tackles the dilemma, quote, although the realm of virtual intensity that Deleuze's philosophy strives to conceptualize is transcendental in the sense that it is not directly accessible to experience, it is not transcendent. It is not exactly outside experience either. Unquote. The virtual transcendental is immanent to actual experience, according to Masumi, like the other side of a coin. But the empirical world of the merely actual experiences somehow falls short of the real, that is, the virtual, experience of an event. The Deleuzian event is, quote, super-empirical, being both substanceless and durationless in its purity. Intensity, or the virtual then, is quasi-experiential, quote, not exactly outside actual experience, but not fully within it either. A bit inside and a bit outside, like a salesman with his foot in your door. This is hardly, for me anyway, the most informative explanation of the virtual going, and, as solutions go, not my favourite. But, again, to be fair to Masumi and the commentators, it's a mammoth task that they face to explain this notion of virtual. There are different vocabularies we can spot when reading through Deleuze's duplicitous philosophy, a selection from which might comprise, on the one hand, extensio, quantity, repetition, machinism, actuality, and the idea, and on the other hand, spatium, quality, difference, vitality, the actual and affectivity. I should swap those around. Admittedly, these languages cannot be consistently opposed according to a simple principle of objective real versus subjective appearance, because they have features that respectively lie outside of those two categories. But there are certain significant overlaps as well. No doubt either we shouldn't oppose any such list like this, for in Deleuze's philosophy of immanence, dualisms are often opposed and deposed in the name of an ontological monism, with a neologistic vocabulary intended to reconcile not only subject and object, interior and exterior, but also any other similar hierarchical or oppositional structures. However, no less than Masumi's variation on Deleuze, the probity of this operation is not always so evident, because it most often, in my mind, embeds the duality to be dissolved in a new language which secretes another duality within itself. So the dualism just keeps coming back, even with the creation of a new language. Now, the most pertinent dyads with respect to this clandestine dualism in Deleuze are immanence transcendence, molecular molar, past present, infinite finite, and difference and repetition, each of which we could tackle individually. But fundamental to all is the dyad, I believe, of virtual actual, which subtends them as a foundational base, and it is this that I've been researching of late. Before looking at the virtual and the actual, though, I must, or at least I'm going to, tackle the notion of immanence pertinent to Deleuze's thought. Immanence stands for the experiential intensity for Deleuze, but, like the salesman's foot, it also stands for a kind of interior, that of the virtual. Next section. Now, my recent work has been an attempt to navigate the different theories of immanence, as I said at the start, found in figures such as Michel Henry, Alain Badiou, and François Laruelle, as well as Gilles Deleuze. What is most interesting for me is the fact that each of these philosophies carve up reality into an inside with no outside in such different ways, be it through the categories of mathematics, naturalism, meta-theory, or a radicalized form of phenomenology. Indeed, such is the variable understanding of immanence amongst these, that the meaning of inside and outside, both literal and figurative, is multiplied and mobilized. And this mobilization is best understood, I'd argue, through the concept of virtual and actual, as I'll now explain. The other reason for my interest in this particular set of 4 philosophers of immanence is because all 4 also belong, in one form or another, to my favorite type of philosophy, which is namely process philosophy. Process truth for Badiou, process naturalism for Deleuze, process metaphilosophy for Laruelle, process phenomenology for Michel Henry. In each case, there is a focus on how immanence relates to change, the immanent change of truth procedures for Badiou, in material flows on the plane of immanence for Deleuze, in philosophical mutation as such for Laruelle, or in life as it engenders itself immanently for Henry. But here we come to an interesting problem. For while 3 of these 4 process thinkers adopt a similar approach to process, namely what I'd call an actualist one of them begs to differ. Badiou, Henry, and Laruelle are all actualists, but Deleuze alone believes that process needs the virtual to condition it, an idea he claims to have inherited from Bergson. The virtualist, such as Deleuze, insists on the ontological primacy of the virtual because it is the virtual that conditions all process, all change. It is the ontological reservoir of immanent difference out of which particular new beings actualize themselves. So what is actualism, by contrast? Actualism follows the view, in various forms, that there are no hidden forces, no potentials, no potencies, ground or substrate, no possibles awaiting actualization, no ontological hinterworld, no absolute unconscious, no realm of anomalous identity, no ambiguous or wild being, with or without a capital B. It proposes that the actual is always already actualized somewhere, to some perspective. It is a form of ontological anti-reductionism, a saving of the appearances, only at every level and not just as regards how things appear to us. But it does not follow that actualism is equivalent to absolute immanence alone, for actualism is not about transcendence or immanence aside from each other, but alongside each other, the creation of many forms of inside and outside. Hence, I believe it is worth concentrating on the virtual-actual distinction amongst Badiou, Deleuze, Henry, and Laruelle, precisely because it operates more effectively than the transcendence-immanence difference, given the utterly different types or levels of immanence found in the respective philosophies, where what would be an outside for one would be an inside for another. Ultimately, transcendence and immanence is not about the dichotomy of inside and outside, but also the creation of this dichotomy in different modalities according to either actualist or virtualist principles. In my mind, only the actualist principles work because they, 1, avoid the postulation of an unexperienced hinterworld, Masumi's super-empirical, and 2, the reduction of novelty to a pre-given set of potentials, even though some people dress up these potentials as differential and so on. But I still think they reduce novelty. So this allows me to address the manner in which 2 actualist philosophers of immanence, Badiou and Henry, differ from Deleuze. I'm particularly interested in the stark contrast between Henry and Badiou, for they take immanence in very interesting but diametrically opposed directions. Henry bases immanence on feeling or affectivity. As such, he contrasts strongly with the mathematical immanentism of Badiou, who would argue that feeling is the furthest thing we can have from ontology, from the real. There is only what he calls the matheme. The matheme is fundamental. There is no equivalent fundamental patheme, if you want to coin a phrase from pathos. Henry, on the contrary, takes mathematics as but a view taken on affectivity, an illusory outside, a virtual image of effect. So both of them are actualists, both of them are philosophers of immanence, but they refer to each other as transcendental philosophers, as virtualist philosophers, because your mathematics is just this image outside. Badiou would say, reciprocally, affectivity is just some sort of figment of your imagination. It's not fundamental, at least. As such, Badiou and Henry reject Deleuze's virtualism while also sharing much of his thinking, albeit by taking, respectively, only one or other of Deleuze's tendencies and extending it ad infinitum. Badiou emphasizes the idea, quantity, and mathesis in Deleuze. Henry, affectivity, quality, and pathos. Neither share his virtualism, for Badiou takes the idea and makes it actual, while Henry takes affect and makes it actual. In sum, Badiou and Henry take Deleuze to his respective limits in quantity, the pure multiple as potentially countable, and quality, pure difference as affectivity. Hence the strong contrast Badiou and Henry set when compared with each other alone. For Badiou, mathematics alone exists, but not affect. For Henry, affect alone exists, but not mathematics. Henry and Badiou are consequently related to each other via the reductios their work inadvertently perform on the twin tendencies within Deleuze, towards an objective idealism, the world as mathematical calculus, on the one hand, which is definitely there in Deleuze, or towards a subjectivizing patheticism, the world as affect, on the other. Placed in their own more extreme settings, each has its own merits. One shared one being that Badiou's mathematicism and Henry's patheticism both avoid the problems of Deleuze's dualism. The immanence they endorse leaves nothing outside of itself. Set theory is all-encompassing for Badiou. It alone concerns what is. Or for Henry, ontology is phenomenology, understood as a process of auto-affection. The non-affective world is unreal. Neither, in other words, neither have a two-worlds view, virtual and actual, when it comes to ontology. What you see is what you get. But what you get, if you like, what is actual, is different for each of these two philosophers. The eventual site within a set for Badiou, the affective state for Henry. Where Henry derives fundamental layers of self-affection, Badiou derives fundamental layers and sets of sets. He's big into set theory, we won't go there. Both believe that there are layers or levels to this actuality. And though their composition is quite different, pathetic and mathematical respectively, they still have the same invisible structure of reflexivity, the feeling in Henry, the set of sets in Badiou. To crystallize the difference between Badiou and Henry even more, we might paraphrase Immanuel Kant and say that affectivity without mathematics is blind, and mathematics without affectivity is empty. But Henry welcomes blindness, and Badiou resolutely grounds his ontology on the empty set, that is, on the void. From the point of view we are articulating here, though, both forms of the actual, patheme and matheme, are needed as ideal poles between which a movement is installed. Each pole has what the other needs, the view that affectivity takes of itself in Henry, and the affect that makes any view possible, Badiou's abstract views of mathematics. Okay. Be glad to hear that's all of the dry philosophy. Okay, so back to diagrams. In order to make this point clearer, I'm now going to engage in a little diagrammatology, to borrow a term coined by W.J.T. Mitchell. This will involve combining my own metaphilosophical speculations with a few cursory remarks and some highly speculative suggestions, in part stemming from Badiou, Henry, and Deleuze themselves on the notion of the abstract and the diagrammatic. So to begin with, in Badiou's very latest thinking, he has supplemented his set theoretical ontological base with a theory concerning how that base is linked to our phenomenal world. In other words, this abstract set theory, which is being, how does that connect with the world, the grimy world of feelings and bodies that we inhabit? To do this, however, he has still remained on the level of mathematics, only now in another field called category theory. Category theory provides him with a mediating logic for situations, worlds, or appearances that is born out of modern algebraic geometry. It uses what are called topoi, which are forms of geometrical relationships depicted by arrows. And there's an example you get in some of the latest writing of Badiou. So those are kind of arrows. They're kind of not just static, they're meant to be dynamic. They're vectors. It's about moving relationships between A, C, and B, and so on. Significantly, Badiou's topoi are descriptive rather than axiomatic, as set theory was. That is, they are not based on a decision or ontological commitment to found the world in such and such a way, but on a description of the world, what Badiou also calls a sort of geometry of truth. As such, Badiou has at last embraced what he calls a minimal phenomenology of appearance, an abstract phenomenology of localization, unquote. Moreover, in this light, Badiou sees no difference between a transcendental logic and formal logic. Every logic, he says, is a logic of appearance. So Badiou wants to fuse together what Immanuel Kant famously held apart. The phenomenon is the noumenon. I quote again, quote, formal logic is a diagrammatic approach to transcendental logic, a particular section of transcendental logic. So here's an example of this diagrammatic logic applied to a real situation. We were talking about politics earlier on. This is Badiou's approach to politics. This is a particular situation, I think it's the 1980s, where there's a sans-papiers, the kind of people in France, illegal immigrants and so on. Situation involved at this place in Paris, I think it was, the police, the progressive citizen, that's kind of people like us, presumably, bleeding art liberals who read The Guardian. What do we do? Condemn the police, support the illegal immigrants, and so on and so on. Now, those lines are vectors, remember. They're talking about mathematical, geometrical relationships between these objects, these phenomena. Now, what I find interesting is that Badiou believes that in his latest work, he is proceeding from being, ontology, to appearance, phenomenology, by going from set theory to topoi theory. But from the perspective of Michel Henry, Badiou is simply moving from one more abstract spatialization of reality to another less abstract one. That is, to one that is still and always a phenomenal experience, albeit to one with more effective perceptual concreteness. So it's still extremely, not as abstract as set theory, but still fairly abstract. And for a phenomenologist like Badiou, things like geometry come from a certain kind of lived world, a phenomenological world. It's an abstraction from it. But despite his differences with Badiou, Henry does not reject abstraction all out. Rather, his own version of abstraction affectivizes it, if I can use that word. We get Henry's alternative picture of abstraction from his work on the art of Vasily Kandinsky. Kandinsky's peculiar form of abstraction embodies what Henry calls abstract content of, quote, invisible life in its tireless coming into itself, a radical subjectivity which is where there is neither light nor world. Henry claims that the worlds that figurative art tries to depict and the one that Kandinsky works with are not at all the same. The former is Galilean and exterior. The world that Kandinsky's abstract art unveils is quite different, one where sensible qualities are integral, qualities that are sonorous tonalities or modes of life. Such art is non-referential in its picturality. This abstract does not come from the figurative, but is its own self-feeling, self-generating subject. So it is not an abstracted from the world, something abstracted from the world. It is itself. To quote again, quote, this original, subjective, dynamic, impressional, and pathetic nature in art is the true nature which is the essence of life. It is the cosmos. So he's arguing that in the work of Kandinsky, you are seeing the cosmos. Let's have a look at the cosmos. There's a bit of the cosmos there. So the world as a form of abstract process, that one's called Black and Violet. Oh, it's good. The world as a form of abstract process is redeemed, but only by equating it with life and affect. Abstraction needs a feeling subject, though not necessarily a human subject, to generate the event of abstraction. Abstraction must come from somewhere or someone, and that someone is its own self-affecting self. Okay, so that's Badiou and Henry. What of Deleuze and abstraction? Here we can look to both his book on Francis Bacon, The Logic of Sensation, and 1,000 Plateaus. The famous abstract machines of 1,000 Plateaus are also described as diagrams, quote, the aspect or moment at which nothing but functions and matters remain. A diagram has neither substance nor form, neither content nor expression. The diagram is a purity, and as pure, it must be virtual. The diagram is what, quote, retains the most deterritorialized content and the most deterritorialized expression in order to conjugate them, unquote. Diagramming, according to Deleuze, raises a trait to its highest power. It carries it off. So here are some famous examples. These are the diagrams from Thousand Plateaus of various semiotic systems, pre, counter, post, and just plain old signifying systems. I'm not going to try and display them here because I probably wouldn't be able to. Diagrams of faciality. I'm going to come back to some of the other diagrams, more famous diagrams of faciality from Thousand Plateaus in a bit. Let me just say, spoil the next one. Diagrams of Leibnizian monadology. And right, leave it there. So that's the actually that should say monads over there, but that's from the fold. Clean again, mixed in there. Now, so far, a lot of these diagrams do seem quite conceptualist, idealist even. Indeed, Deleuze's diagrammatology might even remind one of Badiou's topoi. Yet Deleuze contends that, quote, diagrammatization is not axiomatization. It is not as abstract as their theory. They are concrete conditions of the actual, he says. Diagrams are concrete conditions of the actual. But they themselves are still not actual. In Deleuze's work on Francis Bacon, this comes out again, but this time more ambivalently. His approach here is taken up with prolonged reflections on rhythm theory, the coexistence of all movements on a canvas. Subtending the concrete machines of each canvas is the abstract machine, a diagram of spots, lines, and zones. The language of the diagram is analogical, working productively through modulation. And he talks about modulation and synthesizers a lot when talking about the analogical diagram. The diagram is reducible neither to symbol nor to an icon. It is not a code either. Deleuze addresses a figural geometry that is between abstraction and resemblance, between mathematical number and the organic, between symbol and icon, or if you prefer, between Badiou and Henry. Quote, this is Deleuze on Bacon. Bacon's geometry gives witness to a high level of spirituality, since it is the spiritual will that leads this geometry away from the organic and in search of elementary forces. Unquote. These forces for Deleuze are haptic rather than optical, tactile rather than visual. Such diagrams can actually fill the whole canvas as a set of suggestive traits, a graph of potentials. The diagram is no longer just an outline, but even involves colours as sensations too. Following Cézanne, Bacon pursues an analogical use of geometry. But analogy here is not understood as resemblance, but as modulation or subtraction. The diagram subtracts. So, in sum, proper abstraction for Deleuze, then, is singular and real. He calls it a non-organic life, a type of line passing between things, a zigzag, a transversal. It is not at all geometric, or scare quotes, Deleuze writes. It is the most living and the most creative line. Now, in the fold, we get diagrams of Deleuze's own, of this in-between state, between neither icon nor symbol, but a living movement. So here we get examples of this. A diagram of the Baroque house, but it's a diagram that also looks like a house. Or over here, diagrams concerning Gothic arches. But also, the actual arch, spatiality of the arch also is making a conceptual point about returns and so on. So they are both, if you like, conceptual and actual physical. Another example here would, of course, be the diagrams of faciality, going back to Thousand Plateaus, which the various lines are talking about proliferation of eyes, multiplication of borders, and so on. They're different kind of faciality machines, but they also look like faces in a way. So they're both conceptual and iconic, or they're meant to be between the two, if you like. But still in all, I'll have to say that these diagrams for Deleuze are not actual. At best, he calls them proto-actual. In the Bacon book, he calls them a germ of order or rhythm. For Bacon, something which begins the act of painting. Or another phrasing, the diagram is a possibility of fact. It is not the fact itself. It is what modulates or subtracts from the virtual. Okay, so that's Deleuze on the diagram as actual. Sorry, as virtual. Final section. I've described Badiou as the thinker of the pure objective and Henry as the thinker of the pure subjective. Both might be said to merge into each other as thinkers of immanence in terms of their purity, their puritanism. Alternatively, I am trying to think about metaphilosophy as a diagrammatic movement of thought from subject to object, from inside to outside, and back again. Recall Leibniz's realist stance and Deleuze's relativist one as regards the imagery of thought. Diagrammatic metaphilosophy postulates that spatialization is unreal in terms of content, but real in terms of form. These diagrams are processes, after all, as well. The diagram is a moving form. It is a between form, and it embodies real and actual connections. Like Kandinsky's abstract points, lines, and planes, the diagram is a living philosophical abstraction, and one that remains actual, I think, so long as it keeps moving. Hence, my own diagrams, as you'll see, they're static and hence, in a sense, false, in the literal notion of static. That is how such a metaphilosophy can accommodate, I believe, the impossible purities of Henry and Badiou's patheme and matheme. For these ideals are also describable as attractors within a phase space of philosophical thought, with a sketchable, diagrammatic movement existing between them. This diagrammatic movement would be an example of a naturalistic metaphilosophy, both concrete and abstract. So now, I'm going to give an example of how such a metaphilosophy might progress, using a diagrammatic thinking that is both formal, but also aware of its affective and perceptual origins as spatialized thought, to think about and see the relationship between virtualist and actualist philosophies, and finally to outline the pure actualisms of Henry, pure effect, and Badiou, pure idea, as virtual poles between which a metaphilosophical movement, itself actual, can run. Okay, so this is going to be a quick run through in the time I've got left. Right. So, here, this is from the plea. This is from the thought. This is a diagram of Deleuze's virtual actual dualism, for instance. He makes a strong distinction between virtual and the possible. The virtual is actualized, the possible is realized. Virtual good, possible bad. Actualization is iffy. For the most part, virtuality is seemingly what is real. The virtual is, for the most part, counted as the ontological. The actual is somehow merely phenomenal. He takes that supposedly from Bergson. And this is Bergson's famous depiction in matter and memory. The plane of representation at point S, which is the pure present. On this plane, AB is the pure virtual. Now, there is a way of, if you like, critiquing that. Lou's seen this sequence of diagrams before. But basically, I think if you read Bergson in his words, but also in his diagrams, you should amend Deleuze's rendering by thinking in terms, not only are there planes of the so-called virtual, but there are also planes of the actual, or planes of the present. It's not that there is one present actuality with the great virtual bearing down on it, but you can actually get rid of any need for the pure virtual by multiplying our notion of the present, which is precisely what a lot of Bergson's work is all about, from as early as Time and Free Will. It was always about the multiplicity of the present, so it's not as though there is the present or the actual and the virtual hovering around it like some sort of mysterious halo, but rather there is a multiplicity of actualities, hence P prime, P double prime, and so on. Now that diagram has a certain etymology, and I went in this paper I gave in Italy through a whole set of similar diagrams. But the diagrams were linked to words, like this one, Lacan, from Lacan. I forgot which seminar it is. Somebody might know. Does anybody know? I think it might be the Rome lectures, maybe not. And this is the cones of representation you get in Lacan. Lacan is talking about the cones of representation at the same time as he's talking about Merleau-Ponty's chiasm. Merleau-Ponty's chiasm, which is also a set of two cones intersecting. If you look at the two lines there, it's two intersecting cones point to point. Lacan brings up his conic depiction of representation at the same time as he's talking about Merleau-Ponty's chiasm. He's referring to the visible and the invisible. The section in the invisible and the invisible, where Merleau-Ponty is talking about the chiasm, he is alluding to a diagram in Bergson. It's that diagram he's alluding to in Bergson's Matter and Memory. I can show it to you all. If you don't believe me, it's true. That diagram has, if you like, a genealogical relationship going via Lacan and Merleau-Ponty back to Deleuze and Deleuze's misuse of Bergson's diagram. And this is one which multiplies both the virtual and the actual. The world is equally multiple, diagrammatically, and so on. Now, here is how I get to my own diagram that I opened with. My diagram that I opened with at the start of the paper is, if you like, the point, the final point. Now, I'm not going to be able to argue my way all the way there. But if you have a sad enough life and you read enough Bergson and so on, and you ponder about these diagrams, you eventually start to work out a new kind of diagrammatic understanding. So, following matter and memory, chapter 4, this diagram, the other earlier diagrams from chapter 3, basically Bergson takes memory and materializes it. The diagrams concerning the virtual and the actual concerning memory perception, he just puts into matter. Matter itself has its own enduring qualities. And hence you can bring up this kind of more complicated diagram, which is, somebody's pointed out to me, it's a double diploid, so I put that up. It's a double diploid, he said. This is good, isn't it? So that's from matter and memory, double diploid. The language, if you know the stuff, integration, differentiation, and so on, qualitative multiplicity, pure perception, pure memory, if you know the Bergson, you know this is kind of, if you like, what these lines are about. And they are depicting the relationships between the concepts in particular chapter 4, the climactic chapter of matter and memory. After creative revolution, this double diploid is reiterated. In other words, it's not just about human psychology, not even about living memory, it's about matter as such, even more broadly. So if you like, it is everything all the way down and all the way out, cosmically, so to speak, reiterated. The diagram, the double diploid, just goes everywhere, because creative evolution is basically a cosmology of a living cosmos. So you get this double diploid, which I'm fascinated by, and it's then got other language you can apply to it. Let's say the law of twofold frenzy, which comes from his last book, Two Sources of Morality and Religion, and so on. Again, the law of twofold frenzy is a bit like the law of differentiation and dissociation in matter and memory, and those lines come up again and again. This is where you're all starting to suspect he is mad. He was true. It's true. I'll put these diagrams on my gravestone. And finally, if you're really sad, you can spend a whole year of a sabbatical working out this goddamn diagram. This is what I did in 1997. And all the jargon here is, if you like, superimposable onto those lines. And obviously it is a reductive way of thinking. It is spatialization. But it actually works, I think, as the all-encompassing diagram. All the lines have certain meanings, blah, blah, blah. But for the most part, the jargon is Bergson's jargon. Now, given that I am a Bergsonian, so to speak, this diagram, the double diploid, which is meant to describe everything, the great thing about Bergson is that it's not just a description of the world, but being a philosopher of immanence, it's also a description about how we describe the world. It's a description of philosophy. It's a metaphilosophical description. The law of twofold frenzy and so on and so on, those are applicable not just to nature's forces or material forces. They are also applicable to the way theories work, according to Bergson. Theory works according to the law of twofold frenzy, or the law of dissociation and differentiation and integration, etc., etc., etc. So basically, that diagram that I started with is a Bergsonian diagram, or a diagrammatic metaphilosophy, that is meant to relate Badiou and Henry, or an extreme philosophers. So in a sense, where in the earlier diagram, for instance, you have pure perception and pure memory, which are typically Bergsonian ideas, you can actually replace the, if you like, field for the diagram, no longer be talking about psychology, and turn it into metaphilosophy. The diagram will also work in metaphilosophy. But instead of pure perception, you've got Badiou, and I can give you an argument as to why Badiou relates to pure perception. And for pure memory or pure quality, you'd have Henry. What would be important about is not the names, what goes up there, but the relationships, because the diagrams are all about movement. It's about the relationship of ideas that themselves, as ideas, are only another set of reiterated movements. In other words, the double diploid reiterates all the way down. So any philosopher, you can take a philosopher and unpack his or her ideas as a sense, if you're Bergsonian, as a type of twofold frenzy, dualities coming back together. And the best example of this is actually Deleuze himself. If you like, this is also a diagrammatic philosophy, or encompassing of Deleuze's philosophy, which is all about tendencies in his own work from a certain kind of body of virtual works that are then brought out in different ways by commentators, by, prodigal son disciples like Henry and Badiou, and they, if you like, actualize his thinking in different ways. I think that's enough of my madness. Yes, it is. Goodbye.